Story number 1.
I had always been skeptical of ghosts. Stories about hauntings were entertaining, sure, but I never thought they could be real. That changed the year I moved to a small town in Pennsylvania for a new job. I didn't know then that I was walking straight into something I'd never be able to explain. The house I rented was old, but charming in its own way, Victorian style with a wraparound porch and creaky wooden floors. It had been sitting empty for years, and the landlord seemed almost too eager to rent it out. The rent was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I didn't question it. It was perfect for me. Quiet, affordable, and away from the noise of the city. I should have asked why no one else had wanted to live there. At first, everything seemed normal. I spent the first week unpacking, getting to know the town, and settling into my new routine. The neighbors were friendly but distant, always giving me odd looks when I mentioned where I was living. One older woman, Mrs. Taylor, stopped me outside the grocery store one day. "You're living in the old Morgan house?" she asked, her voice tight. I nodded. "Yeah, just moved in. Why?" She hesitated, her wrinkled hands gripping the handle of her shopping cart. "Nothing," she said after a long pause. "Just be careful." I didn't press her for more, but her words lingered in my mind longer than I cared to admit. It started small. The first night I heard the noises, I told myself it was just the house settling. Old places creak, after all. But as the nights passed, the sounds became harder to ignore. Soft footsteps on the second floor when I was downstairs, the creak of a door opening when none had moved, the faint sound of something dragging across the floor above me. One night I was sitting in the living room reading when I heard it. Laughter. A child's laughter. It was faint, almost distant, but unmistakable. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There were no children in the house. The laughter came again, this time from upstairs. I grabbed a flashlight and forced myself to go up. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the window at the end of the hall. I checked each room, empty. Nothing looked out of place. I told myself I was just imagining things. Maybe a neighbor's kid was playing outside, and the sound carried through the walls. That was possible, right? But deep down, I knew better. Things escalated quickly after that. One night, I woke up gasping for breath, my chest tight as if something heavy was sitting on it. I struggled to move, to scream, but I was completely paralyzed. In the corner of the room, I saw it. A shadow. It stood motionless, its shape barely distinguishable from the darkness, but I felt it watching me. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the pressure lifted. My body jerked upright and I gasped for air. The shadow was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found scratches on the bedroom door, 3 deep, jagged marks running down the wood. I tried to convince myself I had done it in my sleep, maybe sleepwalking or something. But the scratches were too high up, too precise. I wasn't alone in that house. The final straw came a few nights later. I had started keeping the hallway light on at night, a small comfort in an otherwise suffocating atmosphere. That night, I woke up again not because of a noise, but because of a feeling, an overwhelming sense of dread. I turned my head toward the bedroom door, and it was open. I knew, without a doubt, that I had closed and locked it before bed. My stomach twisted. Then I heard it. A whisper, right next to my bed. I turned my head slowly, too terrified to move any faster. There, standing beside me, was a figure. A woman. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and sunken, her mouth twisted into something that was almost a smile. She reached out. I scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping as I backed away. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, it vanished. I didn't wait until morning. I grabbed my things, threw them into a bag, and left. I never went back to that house. I didn't even return for the rest of my things. The landlord didn't ask any questions when I called to break my lease. It was almost as if he had been expecting it. Months later, I was scrolling through old newspaper archives, still trying to make sense of what happened. That's when I found it. An article from over a century ago. A woman named Eleanor Morgan had lived in that house. She had been accused of witchcraft and locked away in the attic by her own family, left to die alone. The house had been cursed ever since. I never told anyone what happened to me. But sometimes, even now, when I'm alone in my apartment, I still hear the laughter. And I never, ever turn around. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I never considered myself a believer in the paranormal. I grew up in a world where everything had a rational explanation. A creaky floorboard, just the house settling. Shadows moving in the corner of your eye, just a trick of the light. But some things defy explanation, and I learned that the hard way. It started in the fall of 2019 when I moved into an old house on the outskirts of a quiet town. The place was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but I didn't question it. I was in my late 20s, trying to save money, and this place was perfect. At least, that's what I thought at first. The house was small but cozy, with wooden floors, a fireplace, and a basement I had no intention of using. The previous tenant had left some furniture behind, an old couch, a dining table, and a heavy antique mirror in the hallway that looked like it belonged in a Victorian mansion. The landlord, a quiet older man named Mr. Hensley, was eager to get the lease signed. He barely even asked me any questions, just handed over the keys and told me to call if I needed anything. The first few nights were uneventful. The house had its quirks, strange noises, drafty windows, but nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't until the fourth night that I noticed something was off. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I lived alone. The sound was soft at first, like someone walking barefoot on the wooden floor. I held my breath, listening. The steps moved closer to my bedroom door, then stopped. I stared at the door, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was the pipes, or maybe I had been half asleep and dreamed it. I turned off my phone and pulled the blanket over my head. The next morning, I found the hallway mirror tilted at an odd angle. I was sure it had been straight when I went to bed. Shrugging it off, I adjusted the mirror and went about my day. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. Doors would open on their own. I would wake up to find kitchen cabinets wide open, even though I always closed them before bed. The whispers started soon after. At first, they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind. But as time went on, I could make out words. They were always the same. Help me. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My heart pounded as I turned on my bedside lamp. The door was open just a crack. I was sure I had closed it before going to sleep. I got up, hesitantly walking toward the door. As I reached out to push it shut, I felt a cold breath against the back of my neck. Every hair on my body stood on end. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me. There was nothing. That was the first time I truly felt afraid. The next day I called Mr. Hensley. "Has anyone else ever complained about strange things happening in this house?" I asked, trying to sound casual. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "You're not the first tenant to ask that." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" Mr. Hensley sighed. "The house has a history. Years ago, a woman named Evelyn lived there. She disappeared without a trace. Some say she left town. Others say she never left at all." I swallowed hard. "What happened to her?" "No one knows for sure," he said, "but every tenant who's lived there since has experienced things." "Why didn't you tell me this before I moved in?" I demanded. "Would you have taken the place if I had?" he asked. I had no answer for that. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the house. Around 2 a.m., the whispers started again. "Help me." But this time, they were louder. Closer. I sat up, my heart pounding. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight. Then I saw it. In the mirror across from my bed, there was a figure. A woman. She stood in the reflection, her face pale, her eyes hollow. Her lips moved, forming the same words I had heard in the whispers. "Help me." I turned my head, expecting to see her standing in my room. There was no one there. But in the mirror, she remained. My hands trembled as I grabbed the blanket and threw it over the mirror. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I decided to do some digging. I went to the town library and searched for any records on Evelyn. What I found made my blood run cold. Evelyn had gone missing in 1956. She was last seen in that very house. According to the old newspaper articles, some suspected her husband had killed her, but no body was ever found. The case went cold. I felt sick. If her spirit was still in the house, was she trying to tell me something? Was she trying to warn me? That night, I made a decision. I was going to leave, but the house had other plans. As I packed my bags, the temperature in the room dropped. The lights flickered, then went out entirely. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Then I heard it, a scraping sound. It was coming from inside the walls. My breathing became shallow as I followed the noise. It led me to the hallway mirror. Slowly, I reached out and pulled the blanket off the mirror. The reflection had changed. The woman was there, but this time she was pointing downward, to the floor. My stomach twisted. I hesitated, then knelt and ran my hands along the wooden planks. And then I felt it, a loose board. Heart pounding, I pried it open. Inside was a small compartment, and in that compartment, bones. My breath caught in my throat. The realization hit me like a truck. Evelyn never left the house. She had been buried beneath it. Before I could react, the air in the room shifted. A presence loomed over me. My phone flickered, then died. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat. And then, a whisper. "Thank you." The oppressive feeling lifted. The air warmed. I knew in that moment she was finally free. The next morning, I called the police. They excavated the space beneath the floor and confirmed what I already knew. The remains were identified as Evelyn Hayes. Her husband had died decades ago, never facing justice. But at least now, she could rest. I moved out that same day. I didn't look back. To this day, I still don't know what I believe. But one thing is certain. Evelyn's story was never finished until she made sure someone finally listened. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I never believed in ghosts. I had always been the kind of person who laughed at so-called true paranormal stories. I loved horror movies, but I never took them seriously. To me, the supernatural was just a bunch of nonsense until I experienced it myself. It happened a few years ago when I moved to a small town for work. I had taken a job in a quiet rural area that wasn't exactly my dream location, but it was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. The town was old, with a history stretching back over 100 years. It had that typical small town charm, friendly neighbors, cozy diners, and buildings that looked like they belonged in another century. I found a cheap rental house on the outskirts of town. It was an old place, but it had character. The landlord was an older man who seemed eager to get someone moved in. He barely asked any questions before handing me the keys. I should have been suspicious, but I was too excited to care. The house was small but comfortable, a single story with a basement I had no intention of using. It had creaky wooden floors, a fireplace that hadn't been used in years, and a strange smell that I chalked up to age. It was a little eerie at night, but nothing I couldn't handle. At first, everything was fine. My days were busy with work, and at night I'd come home, eat dinner, and watch TV until I fell asleep. But then, little things started happening. It began with the feeling of being watched. I would be sitting on my couch reading or watching TV, and suddenly the air in the room would shift. My skin would prickle as if someone were standing right behind me. More than once I turned around expecting to see someone, but the house was always empty. Then came the noises. At night, as I lay in bed, I would hear faint whispers, soft, almost unintelligible, like voices drifting through the air. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe the house settling. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. I bolted upright in bed, my heart hammering. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate steps moving across the hardwood floor. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside the house. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my hands shaking. I crept out of bed, barely breathing as I stepped into the hallway. Nothing. I checked every room, turned on every light. The house was empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The next morning, I called my landlord. I didn't tell him I thought the house was haunted. I wasn't ready to admit that even to myself. Instead, I asked him about the history of the place, if anything unusual had ever happened there. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a low voice, he said, "I thought you'd be fine. No one's lasted more than a few months in that house." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then sighed. "There was a woman who lived there decades ago. Her name was Eleanor Hayes. She died there. They say she never left. I forced myself to swallow. How did she die? Another pause. Then she hung herself in the basement. I felt cold all over. That night, I locked my bedroom door. It didn't help. At exactly 3:14 a.m., I woke up gasping for air. It felt like something heavy was pressing down on my chest. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, paralyzed, and then I heard it. A whisper, so close to my ear, it sent shivers down my spine. Get out. I barely managed to suck in a breath. My vision blurred as panic set in. Then, as suddenly as it started, the pressure lifted. I sat up, gasping, my heart racing. The room was freezing, and the air felt thick, heavy. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't alone. The next morning, I made up my mind. I had to leave. I started packing my things, shoving clothes into suitcases, not caring about being neat. I didn't even want to stay one more night. But as I was zipping up my bag, something made me stop. The basement. I hadn't been down there since moving in. I had no reason to. But now, it felt like something was pulling me toward it. I didn't want to go. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. But I had to see. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the narrow staircase. The air grew colder with every step. The basement smelled damp, the concrete floor covered in dust, old furniture and boxes were stacked against the walls. And then, in the center of the room, I saw it. An old wooden chair, and above it, a hook in the ceiling. My breath caught in my throat. This was where she had done it. Then behind me, I heard the creak of a floorboard. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my grip, and there she was, a woman standing in the shadows. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and dark. Her hair hung in tangled strands over her shoulders. She wore a nightgown, old and stained. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stared at me. And then her mouth opened, too wide, unnatural. A horrible rasping sound filled the air. The light flickered. The temperature dropped even further. I ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the house, out of the yard, into my car. I didn't even grab the rest of my things. I drove away and never looked back. A week later, I got a call from my landlord. He wasn't angry that I had left suddenly. He just asked one question. "You saw her, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I still dream about that house. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night feeling that same heavy pressure on my chest. And sometimes, just for a moment, I hear a whisper.
Story number 4.
I never used to believe in ghosts. I thought paranormal experiences were just exaggerated stories people told for attention or to scare each other. I was one of those people who rolled their eyes whenever someone claimed they saw a ghost. But that was before I moved into the house on Willow Lane. I was 28 when I took a job in a quiet town in upstate New York. It was a fresh start after a difficult breakup and a series of bad decisions that had left me desperate for change. The house was perfect. An old but well-maintained colonial-style home with hardwood floors, high ceilings, and a wraparound porch. The rent was suspiciously low, but the landlord assured me it was simply because he had trouble keeping long-term tenants. That should have been a red flag, but I was too eager to move in. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my nights watching TV, cooking, and adjusting to the quiet life outside the city. The house had an eerie stillness to it, but I chalked it up to living alone for the first time. The creaking floors and faint noises at night were just the house settling, I told myself. Then the knocking started. It was always the same. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the walls. At first, I assumed it was the wind or maybe an animal outside. But as the nights passed, I started to notice a pattern. The knocking always came at the same time, 3:15 a.m., and it was always right outside my bedroom wall. One night after a particularly long day at work, I was too exhausted to care. When the knocking came, I groaned and knocked back, hoping it would stop. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then 3 knocks, louder this time. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. It felt like a challenge, an invitation. Something in my gut told me I had made a mistake. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I asked my neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, if she had ever heard strange noises from my house. She was an older woman, probably in her 70s, and had lived on the street for decades. She hesitated before answering. "That house, it has a history," she said finally. "Most people don't stay long." I swallowed. "What kind of history?" She looked at me for a long time before shaking her head. "It's not my place to say." That was all she would tell me. That night, I locked my bedroom door, something I had never done before. The knocking came again at 3:15 a.m., but this time it was closer, on my bedroom door. Tap, tap, tap. I held my breath, my body frozen in fear. Tap, tap, tap. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but then the doorknob started to turn. Slowly, deliberately. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My entire body was paralyzed with terror. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. The door to the attic, which had always been sealed shut, was slightly open. I hadn't even known the house had an attic. I stood at the base of the narrow staircase leading up to it, my stomach twisting into knots. The air smelled different, stale, like something long forgotten. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed a flashlight and climbed up. The attic was nearly empty except for a few old pieces of furniture and a dust-covered mirror leaning against the wall. It wasn't what I saw that terrified me. It was what I felt, a presence. I wasn't alone. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. Scratches on the wooden floor, deep and jagged, as if someone had been dragged across it. Then I saw something that made my breath hitch. A single word carved into the wood. Help! A chill ran down my spine. I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the stairs in my rush to get out. I slammed the attic door shut and nailed it closed. I didn't know why. I just knew that whatever was up there, I didn't want it getting out. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every creak of the house sent my heart racing. I knew I needed answers. The next day, I went to the local library and started digging. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. In 1923, a woman named Evelyn Carter had lived in that house. She had been locked in the attic by her husband and left to die. He told everyone she had run away. But years later, when the house was being renovated, workers found her remains in the walls. The most chilling part? The report mentioned how they had found the word help scratched into the attic floor. I felt sick. I had answered the knocking. I had acknowledged her. That night was the worst. At 3:15 a.m., the knocking came. But this time it wasn't just 3 knocks. It was relentless, pounding on the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The whole house trembled with the force of it. Then came the whisper. Let me out. The lights flickered. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in short, visible puffs. Then the doorknob to my bedroom turned again. But this time the door burst open. She was there. Pale, skeletal, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted in pain. She reached for me, her fingers bruised and broken. Her voice barely a whisper. Help me. I screamed. The next thing I remember, I was waking up in my car, parked 2 blocks away. I didn't remember leaving the house. I didn't remember grabbing my keys. I never went back. The landlord didn't seem surprised when I broke my lease. He just nodded as if he had seen it all before. A few months later, I heard the house was empty again. Another tenant had moved in and left within weeks. No one stays in that house. Sometimes I wonder if Evelyn is still waiting, knocking, whispering, asking for help. And sometimes late at night I wake up to a familiar sound. Tap, tap, tap. And I know she's still looking for someone to let her out. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I never wanted to believe in ghosts. I liked the idea that everything had a logical explanation, that things like spirits and hauntings were just stories told to scare people. But some experiences shake you to your core, leaving you with no choice but to reconsider everything you thought you knew. It started when I moved into the apartment on Lincoln Street. I was 29, recently divorced, and looking for a fresh start. The apartment was small but perfect for me. 1 bedroom, an open kitchen, and a cozy little living room. Best of all, the rent was cheap. Too cheap. Too cheap. I should have known that was a bad sign. The first month was uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, adjusting to my new job, and exploring the city. The neighbors were friendly but distant, like they didn't want to get too close. There was an older woman who lived next door, Mrs. Reynolds, who always gave me strange looks whenever we passed each other in the hallway. I didn't think much of it. The first strange thing happened about 6 weeks in. I came home late from work, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. As I stepped inside, I had the strangest feeling, like someone had just been in my apartment. The air felt heavy, charged, the kind of feeling you get when someone is standing too close behind you. I checked every room, every closet. Nothing. Then I noticed something strange. The kitchen chairs were pulled away from the table, all of them turned outward. I was sure I hadn't left them that way. I chalked it up to exhaustion, pushed them back in, and went to bed. That was just the beginning. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, barely more than a breath, but it was there. I sat up, my heart hammering. The apartment was silent. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I told myself I had imagined it, maybe a dream lingering as I woke. But then, the next night, it happened again. And again, each time the whispering grew clearer, like a voice just out of reach. I tried to convince myself it was coming from the vents, maybe the neighbor's TV, but deep down I knew better. Then the knocking started. It was always the same, 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. At first, I thought it was coming from my front door, but when I checked, no one was there. Then I realized it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside my apartment. I searched every room, every corner, but I found nothing. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, Mrs. Reynolds was standing outside her door. She watched me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Pity, maybe? Or fear? "You should move," she said abruptly. I paused, caught off guard. "What?" "This place, it's not safe." I forced a laugh. "Because of ghosts?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Just be careful." I tried to brush it off, but her words stuck with me all day. That night, I decided to set up my phone to record while I slept. I figured if I was hearing things, maybe I could at least prove to myself that it was all in my head. What I found the next morning made my blood run cold. The video was mostly uneventful, just me shifting in bed occasionally. But at exactly 3:12 a.m., something changed. The bedroom door, which had been slightly ajar, slowly creaked open. No wind, no movement, just the door, opening on its own, and then the whispering started. It was low, almost too quiet to make out, but as I turned up the volume, I could hear it clearly. A woman's voice. "Get out." The recording ended a few seconds later. My hands were shaking as I replayed it over and over. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to pack up and never come back. But another part of me, the part that refused to believe in ghosts, kept looking for another explanation. Maybe the door moved because of a draft. Maybe the whisper was interference from another device. I tried to convince myself. Until the next night. I woke up to the sound of my closet door creaking open. The room was pitch black, but I could hear it. The soft scrape of wood against the floor, the faint rustling of something moving inside. I reached for my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The closet door was wide open, and standing inside, barely visible in the dim light, a figure. A woman. Her face was pale, her eyes dark hollows, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. Her fingers were bent at odd angles like they had been broken and never healed. She took a step toward me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then she whispered again, the same words from the recording. "Get out." I scrambled out of bed, nearly tripping as I lunged for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, my heart hammering in my chest. When I finally yanked it open and ran into the hallway, Mrs. Reynolds was there, her expression grim. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked. I could barely speak, could barely think. She was in my closet," I choked out. Mrs. Reynolds sighed like she had been expecting this. "You need to leave, tonight." I didn't argue. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and ran. I didn't take anything else. I didn't care. I spent the night in a motel. The next morning, I called my landlord and told him I was breaking the lease. He didn't even ask why. I moved out that same day. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I started digging into the history of the apartment. In 1974, a woman named Lillian Carter had lived there. She had been reported missing by her family. The police searched for months, but never found her. Until 1998, when a new tenant moved in and started experiencing strange things, they opened up the walls during renovations and found her body sealed inside. I don't know if I was the first to see her or just the latest. All I know is when I left, the knocking stopped. But sometimes late at night, I wake up and swear I hear whispering. And I never ever open my closet door in the dark. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
I never used to believe in the paranormal. I was the type of person who rolled my eyes at ghost stories and dismissed every creak of an old house as just the wind. But some things defy logic. Some things leave you with a fear so deep it lingers in your bones long after the experience is over. It all started when my brother Kevin bought an old house on the outskirts of town. He was always chasing a good deal, and this house was a steal. 3 bedrooms, a large yard, and a quiet neighborhood. The only problem was the house's history. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Margaret Holloway, had lived there for decades before she was found dead in the upstairs bedroom. The official cause of death was natural causes, but there were rumors, stories about how she was never quite right in the head, how she would talk to people who weren't there, and how neighbors swore they saw strange shadows in the windows at night. Kevin brushed it off, convinced that the house just needed a fresh start. He moved in during the fall. At first, everything seemed fine. We would visit on weekends, help him paint, and joke about the ghost house whenever we heard the floor creak. But as the weeks passed, Kevin started acting different. At first, it was small things. He seemed tired all the time, distracted. He said he wasn't sleeping well, that he kept waking up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was watching him. Then, he started hearing noises. "The house is old," I told him. "It's just settling." But he swore it was more than that. Footsteps in the hallway when he was in bed, whispers just on the edge of hearing. One night, he called me in a panic. "There's someone in the house," he whispered. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my keys, and raced over. When I arrived, I found him standing in the living room, brow pale and shaking. He held a baseball bat in his hands, his knuckles white from gripping it so hard. "I heard someone upstairs," he said. "I thought it was a break-in, but when I checked, no one was there." I searched the entire house with him. Every room, every closet, nothing. The doors were locked, the windows shut. "Maybe it was a dream," I said. "Maybe you were half asleep." He didn't argue, but he didn't look convinced either. Things only got worse from there. Kevin started seeing things, shadows that moved when there was no one there, dark shapes lurking at the edge of his vision. He stopped sleeping altogether. He looked like hell, pale, gaunt, his eyes sunken in like he hadn't had a full night's rest in weeks. Then, one night, I got another call. "She's in the house," he said. I froze. "Who?" "The old woman," he whispered. "Margaret." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "She's in my room," he continued. "Standing in the corner, she's just watching me." I grabbed my jacket and rushed over, my heart pounding. When I arrived, Kevin was sitting on the floor in his bedroom, his back pressed against the bed. He was staring at the corner, his eyes wide with terror. "There's no one there," I told him. "She was," he insisted. "She was standing right there." I didn't know what to say. That was the night Kevin left the house. He packed a bag and moved in with me, swearing he'd never go back. A week later, I agreed to go back with him to grab the rest of his things. The house was freezing when we stepped inside, even though it was the middle of the afternoon. The air felt heavy, like the moment before a storm. We went upstairs together. Kevin packed in a rush, shoving clothes and essentials into a duffel bag while I gathered a few loose items from his dresser. Then we heard it. A soft creak, like someone stepping onto the landing just outside the bedroom. We both froze. "Did you hear that?" Kevin whispered. I nodded. Slowly, I stepped toward the door and peered into the hallway. It was empty. I turned back to Kevin. "Let's just go." He nodded and zipped up his bag. We hurried downstairs, but just as we reached the front door, bang! The bedroom door upstairs slammed shut. Kevin and I bolted out of the house and didn't look back. He put the house up for sale the next day. It sat empty for months. No one wanted to buy it. Eventually, he ended up selling it at a loss just to be rid of it. The new owners lasted 3 weeks before moving out. They never said why, but I think I already knew. Kevin never talked about what happened again. He refused to, even years later. But sometimes late at night, I catch him staring at nothing, his expression distant, like he's remembering, like he's still waiting for something to find him. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I never used to believe in ghosts. I was always the logical one, the one who needed evidence before believing in anything supernatural. But sometimes things happen that no logic can explain. It started in the fall of 2017. I had just moved to a small town in upstate New York after accepting a job offer at a local publishing company. The town itself was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. The house I rented was an old Victorian-style home, tucked away on a street lined with trees that turned a beautiful golden color in the autumn. The landlord had been eager to rent it out, offering it at a price that seemed too good to be true. I didn't question it at the time. I just thought I had gotten lucky. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting settled into my new routine. The house had a bit of an eerie feel to it. Old wooden floors that creaked under my footsteps, doors that stuck slightly before giving way, but nothing too unusual for a house built in the early 1900s. Then, about a week in, things started happening. It was small at first. Misplaced objects, things that I swore I had left in one spot only to find them somewhere else entirely. My keys, for instance, would vanish from the kitchen counter and turn up on the coffee table in the living room. A book I had been reading disappeared from my nightstand and showed up on a shelf across the room. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had just forgotten where I had put them. Maybe I was distracted. But then came the noises. At night, as I lay in bed, I would hear faint whispering. It was always too quiet to make out any words, just the soft murmur of a voice. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe the house settling. But then I started to hear footsteps. They came from the hallway outside my bedroom. At first, they were faint, like someone tiptoeing across the floor. But over the nights, they grew louder, more distinct. Heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth. I would lie in bed, frozen, listening as the footsteps moved up and down the hallway. Every time I worked up the courage to check, I found nothing. One night, I decided to leave the hallway light on, hoping it would ease my nerves. But at exactly 3:12 a.m., the light flickered, then shut off completely. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called my landlord. I didn't mention the strange occurrences outright. I just asked if there had been any electrical issues with the house. He hesitated before answering. "No, the wiring is fine," he said. "Why do you ask?" I told him about the light shutting off, about the noises. He was quiet for a long moment before sighing. "You should probably know, the last tenant left in a hurry." I sat up straighter. "Why?" "She claimed the house was haunted." A chill ran through me. She said she would hear voices at night, see things move on their own. I thought she was just imagining things, but, well, you're not the first to ask about noises. I didn't know what to say. That night, I set up my phone to record audio while I slept. I figured if I was just hearing things, the recording would prove it. The next morning, I hesitated before playing it back. The first few hours were normal, just the occasional rustling as I shifted in bed. Then, around 3 a.m., slow, heavy, pacing right outside my door. Then came the whispering. It was faint but unmistakable. A woman's voice. "You shouldn't be here." The whisper was so close, like someone standing right next to the microphone. My blood ran cold. I packed a bag and left that morning, renting a room at a motel in town. I spent the next day at the library, researching the house. What I found made my stomach turn. In 1935, a woman named Eleanor Holloway had lived there. She had been found dead in the upstairs bedroom, the very room I had been sleeping in. The official cause was suicide, but rumors spread that she had been involved in something darker. Some claimed she had dabbled in the occult, that she had tried to summon something she couldn't control. Neighbors reported strange sounds coming from the house, crying, chanting, whispers in a language they didn't recognize. After her death, the house remained empty for years. When new owners moved in, they never stayed long. I didn't go back to the house alone. I called a friend, Jake, who was into paranormal investigations. He agreed to come with me that evening, bringing his equipment. As soon as we stepped inside, the air felt heavy, charged with something unseen. Jake set up a digital recorder and an EMF meter. Within minutes, the meter spiked. "Something's here," he muttered. I swallowed hard. "Can you talk to it?" Jake nodded and started asking questions. "Is anyone here with us?" Silence. Then a faint knock from upstairs. My breath hitched. Jake continued. "What's your name?" A whisper. So quiet I almost missed it. "Eleanor." The air turned ice cold. Jake's face paled. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart hammering. The recorder caught everything. The knocking, the whisper. And then, as we stood frozen in fear, a loud from the bedroom upstairs. We ran. I left the house that night and never went back. I broke my lease, took the financial hit, and moved into a small apartment across town. Sometimes I still dream about that house, about the whispers, about the woman who didn't want me there. And sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I hear her voice. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I used to think ghosts were nothing more than the stuff of stories, the kind of things people whispered about at sleepovers to scare each other. I had never seen anything unexplainable, never felt the presence of something not living. But all of that changed when I took a job at a small, family-owned motel on the outskirts of town. The motel wasn't anything special. Just a row of single-story rooms, a neon sign that flickered on and off, and a small office with an old-fashioned bell on the counter. It had been around since the 1950s, the kind of place where truckers stopped for a night and locals brought their mistresses when they didn't want to be seen. It was cheap, quiet, and mostly empty, especially in the off-season. I took the job because I needed the money. It wasn't glamorous, but it was easy. My shifts were overnight, which meant checking in the occasional guest, doing light cleaning, and keeping an eye on the security cameras. My first few nights were uneventful. I spent most of my time scrolling through my phone or flipping through the old guest log that sat on the counter. Then, about a week in, I noticed something strange. It was around 2 a.m. when the phone at the front desk rang. I picked it up, expecting a guest to be calling from one of the rooms. There was silence on the other end. "Hello?" I said. Nothing. Just dead air. I hung up, assuming it was a prank or a misdial. But a few minutes later, it rang again. This time, there was breathing. Soft, slow, then a woman's voice, barely above a whisper. "Room 6. I glanced at the screen. The call was coming from inside the motel. I checked the log. Room 6 wasn't occupied. A chill ran down my spine. "Hello?" I asked again. The line went dead. I set the phone down and tried to shake it off, but my gut told me something wasn't right. After a few minutes of hesitation, I grabbed the master key and made my way toward room 6. The motel was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every little sound. My footsteps, the distant hum of the vending machine, the wind rattling the sign outside. When I reached the door to room 6, I hesitated. The lights inside were off. No sounds came from within. I knocked lightly. "Hello? Anyone in there?" No answer. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty room. The bed was neatly made, the TV remote still on the nightstand, everything looked normal. But the air was freezing, way colder than the rest of the motel. I stepped inside, flipping on the light. The moment the bulb flickered to life, the bathroom door slammed shut. I jumped back, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaking. No answer. I swallowed hard and took a step toward the bathroom. Slowly, I reached out and turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a small empty space. The shower curtain was drawn, the mirror slightly fogged over as if someone had just taken a hot shower. But no one was there. That was the first night. Over the next few weeks, more strange things happened. Lights flickered in unoccupied rooms. The security cameras would catch glimpses of movement, but when I checked in person, no one was there. The phone calls continued, always at 2 a.m., always from room 6. One night, I mustered up the courage to ask my boss about it. He was an older guy, owned the motel for over 20 years. He gave me a long, tired look before shaking his head. "You're hearing her, aren't you?" he said. My stomach tightened. "Who?" he sighed. "A woman was murdered in that room back in the 70s. Her name was Lydia. She was staying here with a man, some married guy sneaking around behind his wife's back. They got into a fight, and he strangled her, left her body in the bathtub." I felt sick. "They found her 3 days later," he continued. "Guest in the next room complained about the smell." I swallowed the lump in my throat. Why? Why does she still? "Some people don't leave," he said simply. "She calls sometimes. We just don't answer." I wanted to tell him to shut the place down, to call someone, anyone, to cleanse the room, but I knew he wouldn't. The motel was his livelihood, and room 6 still made money. That night, I sat at the desk, staring at the phone, dreading the moment it would ring. At exactly 2 a.m., it did. I didn't answer. But this time, I heard something else. A soft knock at the office door. I turned, my heart pounding. Through the glass window, I saw a woman standing outside. She was dressed in a pale blue nightgown, her hair damp and clinging to her face. Her skin was too pale, her eyes dark and hollow. She raised a hand. Knock, knock. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Just a slow, silent scream. Then she was gone. I quit the next morning. I never went back. A few months later, I heard the motel had been shut down. Someone finally bought the property and tore it down. But sometimes when I drive past where it used to be, I swear I see a figure standing in the empty lot, watching, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. I grew up in a world where everything had a logical explanation. If you heard a creak in the night, it was just the house settling. If you saw something out of the corner of your eye, it was just your mind playing tricks on you. But what happened to me, what I experienced firsthand, had no explanation. And no matter how much I try to convince myself otherwise, I know what I saw, what I felt. It all started when I moved into a small rental house in a quiet town. It wasn't anything special, just a one-story house with a tiny backyard, the kind of place you rent when you're trying to figure out your life. The rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed eager to get someone in as quickly as possible. That should have been my first red flag, but at the time, I wasn't thinking about anything but saving money. The first few nights were uneventful. The house was old, so it creaked and groaned at night, but nothing too unusual. I spent most of my time unpacking, setting up my little home office, and getting used to my new routine. It wasn't until the fourth night that I started noticing things. It started small. I would hear faint noises, like whispers, but too soft to make out any words. At first, I thought it was just the wind outside or maybe the pipes in the walls. Then, things began moving. I would put my keys on the kitchen counter before bed, only to find them on the floor in the morning. A chair in the dining room would be slightly pulled out, even though I knew I had pushed it in. I told myself I was just being forgetful, that I was probably moving things without realizing it. But then, I saw her. It was late, past midnight, and I had just turned off the TV in the living room. I was about to head to bed when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. At first, I thought it was my reflection in the hallway mirror, but when I turned my head, I realized I wasn't looking at a reflection at all. A woman stood at the end of the hallway, partially obscured by the shadows. She was pale, almost unnaturally so, with long, dark hair that hung over her shoulders. She wore a simple, white nightgown, old-fashioned, something out of another time. My breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. She didn't move either. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, staring at each other. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I had been too tired, maybe it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Things only got worse from there. The whispers became clearer. They were no longer just faint sounds in the distance. I could hear them right outside my bedroom door at night. Sometimes I would hear my name being called, soft and drawn out. Then came the dreams. Every night, I would dream of the woman. In my dreams, she would be standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. She never spoke, never moved, just watched. But the worst part was that every time I woke up, I felt like she had been there for real. One night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. My heart pounded as I stared into the darkness, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight, and shined it toward the door. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to tell anyone. I knew how crazy it sounded. And I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. So I started researching the house, trying to find anything that might explain what was happening. That's when I found it. The house had a history, a dark one. Years ago, a woman had lived there. Her name was Margaret Holloway. She had been found dead in the house under mysterious circumstances. Some people said it was a suicide. Others whispered about something more sinister. But one thing was certain. After her death, no one had lived in the house for more than a few months before leaving. I found an old newspaper article with a grainy black and white photo of her. The moment I saw it, my stomach twisted. It was her, the woman I had seen. I should have left right then and there, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I could handle it. Maybe I thought it would go away. But I was wrong. One night, everything came to a head. I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The house was silent, the air heavy. I turned onto my side and grinned, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Then I felt it, a weight on the bed. My entire body froze. It was subtle at first, like the faintest pressure near my feet. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately up the mattress. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I felt something brush against my arm, and then right next to my ear, a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I bolted upright, scrambling to turn on the lamp beside my bed. Light flooded the room. There was no one there, but the door to my bedroom, it was wide open. That was it. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my bags that night, throwing whatever I could into my suitcase. I didn't care about leaving things behind. I just needed to get out. I called a friend, barely able to get the words out, asking if I could stay with them for a while. They didn't ask questions. They just told me to come over. As I drove away, I refused to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if she was watching me leave. I never went back. I never even took the rest of my the rest of my things. I had the landlord send someone else to pack them up. I didn't care about the money I had wasted, about breaking the lease. None of it mattered. I just wanted to be as far away from that house as possible. To this day, I still don't have an explanation. I don't know why she was there, what she wanted, or why she told me to leave. Maybe she was trying to warn me. Maybe she was just angry. All I know is that I will never step foot in that house again, and sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear the whisper in my ear. You shouldn't be here. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I never believed in ghosts. Or at least I didn't until I took a job in a small town where no one seemed to stay for long. The town itself wasn't particularly remarkable, a quiet, forgotten place surrounded by dense woods, the kind of town people moved away from rather than into. But I was desperate. I needed a fresh start, and when I found an online listing for an innkeeper position at the Blackwood Inn, I jumped at the opportunity. The Blackwood Inn was an old bed and breakfast on the outskirts of town, nestled between towering trees and a narrow, winding road that led to nowhere. It had been around for over a century, though ownership had changed hands more times than anyone could count. When I arrived, the place had an eerie, abandoned feel to it. The current owner, a woman named Claire, was friendly enough but seemed relieved to be handing over the responsibilities to someone else. "You'll be fine," she said with a tight smile as she handed me the keys. "Just remember to lock up at night, and don't," she hesitated, "don't pay too much attention to things that don't make sense." I laughed it off. Small town superstition, I thought. The first few weeks were uneventful. My duties were simple, checking in the occasional guest eating breakfast and keeping the place clean. Business was slow, but that was fine by me. I enjoyed the solitude, the quiet. Then, the strange things started happening. It began subtly. I would hear footsteps in the hallway late at night, even when there were no guests. The sound of shuffling, slow and deliberate, moving just outside my door. The first few times, I convinced myself it was just the old building settling. But then I started seeing things. One evening, as I was wiping down the counter in the lobby, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. I turned, expecting to see a guest, but the room was empty. Still, I could have sworn I saw a shadow flicker across the dimly lit hallway. I told myself I was just tired. Then came the whispering, soft, almost unintelligible, like voices carried on the wind. It would start late at night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. At first, I thought it was the trees outside, the wind slipping through the cracks in the old wooden walls. But it wasn't. One night, the whispers grew louder, until I could make out the words. "Leave, before, too late." I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. The room was cold, unnaturally so. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight, but there was nothing there. Just the silence, thick and suffocating. I told myself it was a dream. But things only got worse. One evening, a storm rolled in, the kind that rattled windows and shook the walls. The inn was nearly empty, save for an older couple staying in one of the upstairs rooms. I locked up as usual, making my way to my quarters behind the front desk. Then the knocking started, slow, rhythmic, coming from the front door. I hesitated. No one should be out in that weather. Still, I made my way to the entrance, peering through the peephole. No one was there. The knocking continued. A cold chill crawled up my spine. I tightened my grip on the door handle. Then, from behind me, a whisper. "Don't open it." I spun around, but there was no one there. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to push the fear aside. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe stress was getting to me. That's what I told myself. But then, I found the photographs. I was organizing old records in the storage room when I came across a stack of faded photographs, bound together with twine. They were old, black and white, showing the inn as it was decades ago. But something was wrong. In every photograph, there was a figure standing in the background. A woman. Her face blurred, her dress long and tattered. At first, I thought it was just an old resident, maybe one of the original owners. But the more I looked, the more uneasy I felt. She was in every picture, standing in the shadows, watching. I shoved the photographs back into the box, my hands shaking. That night, I dreamt of her. She stood at the foot of my bed, her face obscured by darkness. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared. When I woke up, my bedroom door was wide open. I started researching the history of the inn. What I found made my blood run cold. The Blackwood Inn had once been a private home belonging to the Whitmore family in the late 1800s. According to old newspaper clippings, the youngest daughter, Eleanor Whitmore, had disappeared without a trace. Some said she had run away. Others believed something much worse had happened. But one thing was certain: she had never been seen again. After her disappearance, strange occurrences began at the house. The Whitmore family moved away, and the property changed hands multiple times, eventually becoming the Blackwood Inn. And every owner had reported the same thing: a woman in the shadows, the whispers, the knocking. That night, I decided I had to leave. I packed my bags, ready to get the hell out of that place. But as I reached for the door, I felt it. The air around me grew heavy. The temperature dropped. And then, the lights flickered. The whispers turned into a low, agonized wail, and behind me, the mirror in the hallway shattered. I turned, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the broken shards of glass, was her reflection. Eleanor. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth open in a silent scream. And then she spoke. "You have to find me." The words sent a wave of terror through me, but beneath that fear, there was something else. Desperation. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was begging for help. I don't know how I found the courage to do what I did next, but I followed the whispers. They led me to the basement, a place I had avoided since moving in. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the air thick with dust and decay. In the corner of the basement, beneath an old rug, I found it. A trapdoor. With trembling hands, I pried it open. Inside, buried beneath the floorboards, were bones. Eleanor had never run away. She had been here the whole time. I called the police, and an investigation was opened. The remains were identified as Eleanor Whitmore. She had finally been found. After that night, the inn felt different. Lighter. The whispers stopped. The knocking ceased. I left soon after. I didn't want to spend another night in that place. But sometimes in my dreams, I still see her. Not as a shadow, not as a ghost, but as a young woman, finally at peace. And for that, I am grateful. Story the end.
Story number 11.
I never considered myself someone who believed in ghosts or the paranormal. I grew up in a house that made its fair share of strange noises, but I always chalked it up to old pipes, shifting wood, or my imagination. But what happened to me a few years ago changed everything. I don't talk about it much, but I think about it all the time. And every time I do, the hairs on my arms stand on end. It's not something you just forget. It stays with you. It started when I moved into an old house in a small town. The kind of place where everyone knows each other, where the streets are quiet at night, and where old buildings hold secrets that no one talks about. The house I rented was one of those places. It was over 100 years old, with creaky wooden floors, high ceilings, and windows that rattled when the wind blew. But I loved it. It had character. It was cheap, and I needed a place to start over. The first few weeks were normal. I worked from home, so I spent a lot of time there. During the day, it was peaceful. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, filling the place with warmth. At night, though, the house felt different. It wasn't just the creaks and groans of an old building settling. It was something else. The first time I felt it, I was lying in bed, half asleep. It was late, probably around 2 a.m. The house was silent, but I woke up suddenly as if something had startled me. I couldn't place what it was, but I had the overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. I lay there, heart pounding, straining to hear anything unusual. And then I did. A soft shuffling sound. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the floor just outside my bedroom door. I froze. My mind raced for a logical explanation. Maybe it was the house settling. Maybe it was an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. I forced myself to sit up and shine the light toward the door. It was closed. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. The house was silent again. I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next few days, more things happened. Small things at first. Objects weren't where I left them. I'd hear faint whispers just on the edge of my hearing. Too quiet to make out the words, but enough to send chills down my spine. Doors creaked open on their own. The air always felt heavier at night, like something unseen was watching me. Then one evening, I saw her. I had been working late, sitting in the small office I had set up near the living room. The only light came from my desk lamp, casting long shadows across the room. I was focused on my screen when I felt it again. That presence, the feeling of being watched. I turned my head slowly, scanning the room, and then I saw her. A figure standing just beyond the doorway, partially obscured by the darkness. A woman. She was pale, almost translucent, with long, dark hair hanging over her face. She wore a simple white dress that looked old, tattered at the edges. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching. Every muscle in my body locked in place. I couldn't breathe, couldn't look away. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then she took a step forward. That was enough to break the spell. I scrambled backward, knocking over my chair in the process. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight, and she was gone. I stood there, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I searched the entire house that night, checking every room, every closet, every shadowed corner. Nothing. But I knew what I had seen. After that night, the activity escalated. The whispers became louder. Sometimes I would hear my name being called, soft and distant, as if carried by the wind. Objects moved before my eyes. Small things like a book shifting slightly on the table, or my keys ending up on the floor when I knew I had left them on the counter. But the worst was the dreams. They started subtly at first. Flashes of images, fragments of memories that didn't belong to me. A woman standing at a window, looking out into the night. A man's voice whispering in her ear, the feeling of cold hands grabbing my wrist. Then one night, I had a dream that didn't feel like a dream at all. I was in my bedroom, lying in bed, unable to move. The room was dark, but I could feel someone standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. Then, slowly, they moved closer. I felt the mattress shift slightly, as if someone had just climbed onto it. The weight pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, fingers. Cold, bony fingers trailing along my arm, up to my throat. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The whisper came again, so close to my ear that I could feel the breath. Leave. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached for my phone, my hands shaking, and checked the time. 3:14 a.m. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I started researching the house. I needed answers. I went to the local library, searching through old newspapers and records, and what I found made my blood run cold. The house had a history, a dark one. Years ago, a woman had lived there, a woman named Eleanor Carter. She had been engaged to a man who, according to the articles, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some people believed he had run away, but others whispered about something more sinister. A few months after he vanished, Eleanor was found dead in the house. The official cause was suicide. But there were rumors that she had been persuaded. I read through every article, my stomach twisting with each detail. The descriptions of Eleanor matched the woman I had seen. The dress, the hair. It was her. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things, throwing whatever I could into suitcases. I didn't care about organizing. I just needed to leave. As I zipped up my last bag, I felt it again, that heavy presence. I turned around and there she was, standing in the doorway of my bedroom, her dark hair hanging over her face, her pale hands reaching out, but this time I could see her eyes. And they weren't just sad, they were angry. The lights flickered violently, the air turning ice cold. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't soft. Leave. I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, engine running, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I never went back to that house. I don't know what really happened to Eleanor, and I don't think I ever will. But I do know one thing. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some ghosts don't want company, and when they tell you to leave, you should listen. Story, the end.